Throughout the Cold War, the threat of mutually assured nuclear destruction hung heavy over humanity. At any moment, an irrational leader, a miscalculation, a technological malfunction could have ignited the abyss. But that didn't happen. We survived. But what if we hadn't? What if the Cold War had turned hot? What if America and the Soviet Union had traded nukes? Let's dive into this terrifying scenario. Act 1. The Hook. For over 4 decades, the Cold War teetered on the edge of Armageddon. But what if it hadn't stayed cold? What if the US and Soviet Union had actually gone to nuclear war? We assume the Cold War didn't escalate because both sides were too rational, too scared, or too evenly matched to strike first. But history is full of near misses. The Cuban Missile Crisis, false alarms, military exercises mistaken for attacks. One mistake, and the entire world could have changed in a single day. Act 2. The Historical Foundation. To understand how we might get to a full-blown nuclear war, we need to rewind to the beginning. After World War II, the alliance between the US, UK, and Soviet Union rapidly crumbled, dividing the world into competing capitalist and communist blocs. Each side bolstered its position with nuclear weapons. Within 2 decades, both the US and USSR tested their first hydrogen bombs, capable of annihilating entire cities from miles away. This rapid escalation continued until each side amassed enough nuclear weapons to destroy the other and the planet multiple times over. This precarious balance of terror became known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The logic was simple. Both sides lose, no one starts the war. For decades, this strategy kept the Cold War cold. Fear of total annihilation prevented either side from striking first. But close calls did occur. The most famous flashpoint was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the USSR placed missiles in Cuba. Just 90 miles from the U.S. mainland, Washington demanded their removal. For 13 tense days, the world hovered on the edge of nuclear war, but behind the scenes, cooler heads prevailed. Back-channel diplomacy established. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev backed down, agreeing to remove the missiles from Cuba. But he also hoped to avoid future confrontations. Khrushchev attempted to reassure his military that the U.S. would not start a nuclear war, since both sides could be destroyed. But those reassurances were not always credible. In October 1983, the world came within minutes of nuclear war, when a Soviet early warning system reported an incoming missile attack from the U.S. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, duty officer at the Soviet Warning Center, determined the alert was a false alarm caused by a computer error. He chose not to report the error, deciding that such a blunder could cost him his career. Instead, he waited until the next shift for verification, had Petrov reported the false alarm. There's a chance Soviet leaders may have retaliated against the perceived U.S. attack before realizing it was a mistake. Another close call occurred during NATO war games called Able Archer 83 in November. The USSR mistook these exercises for a real attack. Soviet radar systems identified simulated signals as actual launch codes. Defense officials grew increasingly alarmed. On the day of the exercise, Soviet nuclear forces were put on high alert, ready to respond to a potential U.S. strike. But Able Archer 83 ended without incident. The Soviet perception of the exercise reduced tensions for the time being. Each of these instances demonstrates how close the world came to nuclear war during the Cold War. Back-channel diplomacy, fear of escalation, and sheer luck prevented disaster. But what if one of these incidents had spiraled out of control? What if miscommunication or malfunction had triggered an all-out nuclear exchange? Let's explore the horrifying consequences. Within minutes of the first nuclear detonation, major U.S. cities like New York, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles would be vaporized. The blast radius of a single nuclear weapon can reach up to 7 kilometers or 4.5 miles. Any survivors in these areas would be met with temperatures reaching 300 million degrees Celsius or 540 million degrees Fahrenheit. Major American cities are densely populated, meaning tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands could be incinerated instantly. But those immediate casualties are only the beginning. The shockwave and thermal radiation released by each nuclear explosion would flatten buildings and ignite fires across entire city blocks. These fires would quickly spread, engulfing entire urban landscapes and blocking major roadways. Survivors trapped in these urban infernos would face horrific burns, suffocating smoke and ash filling their lungs. Many more would perish slowly, inhaling toxic fumes and debris-filled air, while others succumb to injuries sustained during the initial blast. But even as these urban centers burn, the skies above are filled with nuclear fire. In addition to ground-based nuclear missiles, many would be launched from submarines and aircraft carriers, giving little to no warning to nearby countries. NATO bases in Europe would be prime targets, along with Soviet military installations in Eastern Europe and Russia itself. As intercontinental ballistic missiles streaked across the sky, few places would be safe. Major European cities like London, Berlin, Paris, and Moscow would be devastated. The UK and continental Europe are densely populated, meaning the death toll in these areas could reach into the millions from a single day of nuclear strikes, and that's just the beginning. Given the range of Soviet and American missiles, there are few places in the world that wouldn't experience at least one nuclear detonation. Much of the planet would be decimated, literally vaporized or burnt to a crisp. The blast and thermal radiation alone would claim billions of lives. But the immediate physical effects are only one aspect of this horrifying scenario. The long-term effects of a nuclear exchange would prove equally devastating. Within hours, smoke from the countless fires raging across America and Eurasia would begin to block sunlight. Temperatures across the globe would plummet as the planet entered a nuclear winter. This sudden ice age would devastate crops, trigger massive flooding, and collapse entire ecosystems. Within months, much of the world would enter a horrifying ice age. But a nuclear winter presents a different sort of hell. Rather than burning to death, billions would slowly starve as food supplies dwindled and famine spread across the globe. Even areas untouched by nuclear fire would suffer. Regions dependent on trade with affected areas would face economic collapse and widespread starvation. Radiation drift from the numerous nuclear detonations would contaminate water supplies and soil across the planet. Many exposed to high levels of radiation would develop cancer and die within months or years. But given enough time, life would find a way to adapt. Radiation levels would diminish, crops would grow again, animals would repopulate, nature would heal itself. In the aftermath of nuclear winter, the environment would flourish. Humanity, however, might not fare so well. Estimates vary widely, but some experts believe a full-scale nuclear exchange could reduce the human population by 90% or more. The vast majority of remaining humans would face long-term health issues from exposure to radiation. Most immediately threatened would be non-aligned nations. Countries like India, Brazil, large parts of Africa, Indonesia, and others suffered no direct nuclear attacks. They would still face nuclear fallout and economic collapse. Such nations would suffer tremendously, losing millions to starvation and disease. But they would also be uniquely positioned to rebuild in a post-nuclear world. The true devastation would be felt in regions completely destroyed by nuclear fire. Much of Europe, the United States, Russia, and other heavily industrialized areas would be uninhabitable for generations. A handful of rogue states or untouched regions might emerge in the aftermath, but the world they inhabit will be unrecognizable. Decades or even centuries after a nuclear war, pockets of humanity might struggle to rebuild. Assuming civilization is not completely wiped out, recovering from a nuclear exchange would take centuries. Massive amounts of knowledge, infrastructure, and basic services would be lost. Any semblance of modern society could easily collapse into chaos. Nuclear winter could usher humanity into a second dark age, marked by disease, warfare, and destruction. The horrors of a full-scale nuclear exchange would reverberate for generations. The immediate blasts and fires would kill or injure billions. A nuclear winter would see the planet freeze over, causing mass starvation. Areas untouched by nuclear weapons would suffer economic collapse and lingering radiation. Rebuilding civilization from scratch would take centuries if it's even possible. The real danger lies in our own nature. Would humanity regress into tribalism and survivalism? Could we endure millennia of hardship and strife? Or would we revert to barbarism? This is the terrifying truth about what if the Cold War had turned hot. The real tragedy is that this outcome is entirely plausible. For decades, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear annihilation. The Cold War didn't end with fire, but it could have. The real miracle isn't who won, it's that we're all still here. What do you think? How do you think the Cold War could have ended differently? If you enjoyed this video, check out more content. Thanks for watching.